Here is something they don't teach in schools. Before 1916, an American, a Canadian, an Englishman, or a German farmer could wake up on a Monday morning, decide he wanted a second barn, and start building it by noon. There was no application, no fee, no inspection, no waiting period, and no permit number stamped on a form in triplicate, filed away in an office that didn't even exist yet. He owned the land, and he built on the land. That was the entirety of the transaction. Then, almost overnight, that changed. It did not happen slowly or organically through some gradual, reasonable evolution of civic need. The shift was sharp, coordinated, and suspiciously uniform across jurisdictions that had no formal reason to agree with one another. This raises a simple but critical question. Who decided that building on your own property required someone else's permission? And why, in the span of roughly a decade, between 1916 and 1926, did nearly every major urban center in the Western world arrive at the exact same answer? Official history tells us a straightforward, almost boring story. New York City adopted the first comprehensive zoning resolution in the United States in 1916. The explanation given was that skyscrapers were casting shadows over garment district workers, factory fumes were drifting into residential neighborhoods, and the city desperately needed order. So they drew lines on maps, designated zones, and declared where you could build tall and where commerce or families could live. It sounded clean, sensible, and civic-minded. But the official narrative begins to collapse the moment you ask a follow-up question. Why did this need to include private residential construction? Why did a homeowner on a half-acre lot in Queens need to ask permission before adding a bedroom? You can make an argument for regulating factories and skyscrapers, but the pattern that emerged did not stop at commercial regulation. It reached into the most personal, intimate form of ownership a human being can exercise, the act of improving the land you already paid for and already owned. The deeper you look into municipal records from this period, the more an almost architectural pattern emerges. By 1926, just 10 years after New York's resolution, the United States Department of Commerce issued the Standard Zoning Enabling Act. This was a model law that states could simply adopt wholesale. Within that decade, 43 states enacted zoning legislation based on this exact template. These states had vastly different geographies, economies, political cultures, and population densities, yet they implemented the exact same framework, the same logic, and the same core mechanism. You need permission to build, and that permission can be denied. What is truly nagging is the speed, the uniformity, and the near-total absence of meaningful resistance. Where were the dissenters, the state legislatures, or the constitutional challenges arguing that this represented an unprecedented intrusion into private ownership rights? A few existed, but quietly and methodically they were resolved. Courts ruled that zoning was a valid exercise of police power, local governments were granted broad discretion, and the window of autonomy closed. To understand what was lost, you have to understand how land ownership practically operated before this era. The default baseline was autonomy. A man in rural Pennsylvania in 1890 could build a house, add a workshop, convert that workshop into a small mill, add a second floor when his family grew, or tear down a structure he no longer needed, all without a single government form, a single fee, and a single day spent waiting. This was not chaos. This was true ownership. Neighbors had common law recourse if someone created a genuine nuisance or fire hazard, but the state did not intervene beforehand. Zoning did not arrive alone. It arrived as a coordinated four-part system. First came zoning laws to restrict what could be built and where. Second were building permit requirements, mandating government approval and introducing recurring fees. Third came reformed property tax systems, shifting toward assessed value models that tied your annual tax burden directly to the improvements you made. Fourth were building codes, specifying materials and methods to ensure the structures remained subject to ongoing government oversight. Consider how this looks in practice. Imagine a house built in 1908 without any permits. The owner added a wraparound porch in 1911 and built a detached workshop over a summer in 1913. This was entirely unremarkable. Move forward just 20 years, and that exact same act of adding a workshop required an application, a fee, an inspection, a certificate of occupancy, and a permanent increase in annual property taxes. You paid to improve your own land, and then you were penalized with a higher bill every single year because you improved it. The language used in these early resolutions was carefully framed to normalize dependency. The terminology avoided words like restriction and instead used organization, compliance, approval, and certificates. This implied a helpful process rather than a gate. Yet the door opened consistently for developers and corporations who had the capital to navigate the bureaucracy, while the financial and administrative burden fell heavily on the individual, the craftsman, and the small farmer. Strangely, the local municipal records regarding these adoptions are conspicuously thin. Across hundreds of smaller towns, zoning frameworks appeared fully formed in city council minutes with almost no recorded public debate or dissenting votes, as if local administrators were merely transcribing a mandated template. Before this regulatory apparatus, the Western world relied on an autonomous system of communal knowledge passed from generation to generation. The vernacular architecture of the frontier, the self-built towns of the Midwest, and the craftsman homes of the Pacific Northwest were constructed without certified credentials or municipal sign-offs. They stood because the builders had a direct personal stake in their structural integrity. This was replaced by a massive credentialing apparatus of licensed contractors and certified inspectors, an apparatus entirely funded by the property owners through the very fees and taxes used to restrict them. Before 1916, the threshold of a home was one of the most legally protected boundaries in existence. The state required extraordinary justification to cross it. The permit system inverted this power dynamic. The state no longer needed to cross your threshold. Instead, you had to approach them, pay, wait, and prove compliance before hammering a single nail. Under the old logic, buying land was a terminal transaction with minimal ongoing obligations to the state. The shift to assessed value taxation turned improvements into liabilities. The system functionally penalizes investment in your own property while rewarding stasis, transforming true ownership into something that operates structurally more like an indefinitely renewable lease. When the generation that built freely passed away, the knowledge atrophied. The generation that followed grew up in a world where permitting was simply viewed as reality, the natural way things work. The erasure was not dramatic, it merely required the legal framework to persist long enough for lived experience to be replaced by institutional memory. We still use the word ownership with full sincerity, but when a relationship to land carries perpetual tax obligations, building restrictions, and the threat of government seizure for non-compliance, we must ask what ownership truly means. We stopped noticing the system was built at all, leaving us to wonder if it was deliberately designed to manufacture dependency or if it simply evolved as a self-reinforcing machine that penalized autonomy until compliance became our culture.